Counter-Narrative News wanted to share this really important article by a well-known and globally respected Indian leftist intellectual called Pankaj Mishra, who is from northern India. He has written an article in the London Review of Books called The Big Con on the current political class ruling India of Narendra Modi and his BJP party. It's a really interesting article, and it relates to the reality in the world whereby things are shifting away from the post-90s unipolar world to now what was starting to emerge in the late 2000s called the multipolar world. So what does the multipolar world mean for people? People in the Russian and Chinese camp, or in both camps, would argue that this heralds some kind of new dawn of independence and some benefits to oppressed and workers and peasants globally, but they don't really articulate exactly how. But others are arguing that, hold on a second, there was a multipolar world before the unipolar world, obviously, that led to 2 world wars. And a multipolar world does not necessarily mean and result in any benefits to the oppressed masses of the world, but can put them into greater dangers of a slightly different and manipulative kind. Anyway, to the article, quote, early in January, Gautam Adani, an Indian businessman and associate of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, was the world's second richest man. By the end of the month, he had lost much of his fortune after being accused by the US-based investment firm Hindenburg Research of pulling the largest con in corporate history. Facing allegations of fraud and stock market rout, he appeared in Haifa, in Israel, the white settler colonial state of Israel, on the 31st of January, smiling for pictures with Benjamin Netanyahu and hailing the Abraham Accords brokered by Jared Kushner as a game changer as he took charge of Israel's largest port. Adani's liberation of Haifa, as Netanyahu put it, brings closer the prospect of a rail link between Israel and its new friends in Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf. Adani's strategic purchase, for which he paid a staggering $1.2 billion, also limits Chinese influence in the region. And Adani has his own reasons to smile. Standing next to Netanyahu, who had just name-checked his good friend Modi, he could show that he still has allies in high places. The day before, a company controlled by Abu Dhabi's royal family had overlooked the destruction of Adani's market value and pledged to invest a further $400 million in his floundering flagship business, Adani Enterprises Limited. He was hoping to raise $2.5 billion through a stock offering. Indian tycoons close to Modi also promised to buy shares, even as mutual funds and retail investors kept a fastidious distance from the sale. Modi stonewalled questions in Parliament about his partnership with Adani, which began decades ago in Gujarat. Regulatory agencies conspicuously failed to investigate Adani's use of offshore shell companies, and his supporters took to the airwaves to allege that the white people could not bear to see India make progress. In the weeks since, Adani has continued to fall spectacularly. Among other reverses, he has to cancel the $2.5 billion share sale, and he no longer perches near the top of the list of the world's richest men. In his glory days, he would tweet that it was fascinating to hear from Pres Emmanuel Macron at Chateau Versailles, or that he was honoured to host Boris Johnson, the first UK Prime Minister to visit Gujarat at Adani HQ. His social media feeds have now gone dry. Adani has been revealed not only as a beneficiary of the new political and economic order devised by Modi to consolidate Hindu supremacism in India. The neglected details of his frictionless rise show how, after the calamitous romance with Russia's oligarchy, Western politicians, journalists and bankers have facilitated the ascent of another hyper-nationalist elite with dubiously sourced wealth and an extreme aversion to the rule of law and civil liberties. A day after Adani showed up in Haifa, Joe Johnson, Boris Johnson's brother and a former Financial Times journalist elevated to the House of Lords in 2020 after a decade in the Commons, abruptly resigned from Elara Capital, a UK investment firm that, according to Hindenburg, is complicit in the Adani Group's practice of inflating stock prices through shell companies in Mauritius. Johnson claims not to have known what he was getting into. He isn't the only one afflicted with buyer's remorse. Norway's largest pension fund, KLP, recently abandoned all its shares in Adani Green Energy Limited. France's Total Energies, Adani's largest European collaborator and the main source of his credibility among foreign investors, has put a green hydrogen partnership with him on hold and now faces questions in the French press about its involvement with him. The asset management unit of JP Morgan Chase has, in Bloomberg's words, wiped its ESG portfolios clean of the exposure to the Adani empire. Bangladesh, which had agreed to pay dramatically high prices for electricity from Adani tax-free coal-fired plant in India, is now asking to renegotiate. Prompted by such developments, which endanger investors from Australia to Scandinavia, Western journalists have been busy unearthing more facts about Adani, such as the opaque sources of his funding in offshore entities in Mauritius, the Bahamas, and Cyprus, and the role of his elusive elder brother. At least some of these facts had been in plain sight for a long time. For 2 decades, Indian journalists have faced down the legal threats to track the intertwined rise of Modi and Adani. When Modi was barred from travelling to the United States and the European Union because of his suspected complicity in an anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat in 2002, and many Indian businessmen recalled from him, Adani worked hard to rehabilitate his associate. Since becoming Prime Minister in 2014, Modi has repaid the favour. He turned Adani into India's biggest operator of private airports and ports, as well as its leading coal power producer, while presiding over an extensive environmental crisis manifest today across India in toxic smog, heat waves, dry riverbeds, falling groundwater reserves and land subsidence. Modi also helped Adani, a fossil fuel tycoon, to position himself as India's main champion of its commitments to decarbonisation. Last year, the head of Sri Lanka's electricity board was forced to resign after confessing to Parliament that Modi put pressure on the island's then president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to give Adani a renewable energy project. A jaunt to Australia alongside Modi expedited Adani's plan to build the country's biggest ever coal mine and secured him the promise of a massive loan from India's biggest bank. The Wangan and Jangalingu indigenous peoples who live near the mine warned many Western financial institutions against investing in the site, with the help of Greta Thunberg's online campaign, #StopAdani. But Adani still managed to fund it out of his own resources. In part, it has recently become clear by using stock from his green companies as collateral. A visit to Dhaka with Modi resulted in a deal for Adani to sell electricity generated by burning its Australian coal at his environmentally hazardous plant in India at inflated prices to Bangladesh, one of the world's most climate-challenged countries. Modi has counted on sympathetic journalists and financial speculators in the West to cast a seductive veil over his version of political economy, environmental activism and history. I'd bet on Modi to transform India, all of it, including the newly integrated Kashmir region, Roger Cohen of the New York Times wrote in 2019 after Modi annulled the special constitutional status of India's only Muslim-majority state and imposed a months-long curfew. The CEO of McKinsey recently said that we may be living in India's century, praising Modi for implementing policies that have modernized India and supported its growth. The economist and investor Nurul Rubini described the country as a vibrant democracy, but it is becoming harder to evade the bleak reality. Despoiled by a venal, inept and tyrannical regime, India is broken. The title of a disturbing new book by economic historian Ashoka Modi. The number of Indians who sleep hungry rose from 190 million in 2018 to 350 million in 2022, and malnutrition and malnourishment killed nearly 2/3 of the children who died under the age of 5 last year. At the same time, Modi's cronies have flourished. The Economist estimates that the share of billionaire wealth in India derived from cronyism has risen from 29% to 43% in 6 years. According to a recent Oxfam report, India's richest 1% own more than 40.5% of its total wealth in 2021. A statistic that the notorious oligarchies of Russia and Latin America never came close to matching. The new Indian plutocracy owes its swift ascent to Modi, and he has audaciously clarified the quid pro quo. Under the electoral bond scheme he introduced in 2017, any business or special interest group can give unlimited sums of money to his party while keeping the transaction hidden from public scrutiny. Modi also ensures his hegemony by forging a public sphere in which a sycophancy is rewarded and dissent harshly punished. Adani last year took over NDTV, a television news channel that had displayed a rare immunity to hate speech, fake news, and conspiracy theories. Human Rights Watch has detailed a broad onslaught on democratic rights. The Hindu nationalist BJP-led government used abusive and discriminatory policies to repress Muslims and other minorities and arrest activists, journalists, and other critics of the government on politically motivated criminal charges, including of terrorism. Last month, as the BJP's official spokesperson denounced the BBC as the most corrupt organisation in the world, tax officials launched a 60-hour raid on the broadcaster's Indian offices in apparent retaliation for a two-part documentary on Modi's role in anti-Muslim violence. Also last month, the opposition leader Rahul Gandhi was expelled from parliament to put a stop to his persistent questions about Modi's relationship with Adani. Such actions are at last provoking closer international scrutiny of what Modi calls the mother of democracy, though they haven't come as a shock to those who have known about Modi's lifelong allegiance to Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, an organisation that was explicitly inspired by European fascist movements and culpable in the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi in 1948. The defamation campaign against George Soros and the conspiracy-fueled crackdown on India's leading think tank, the Centre for Policy Research, are only the latest in a series of measures, bribing opposition politicians to defect, unleashing mobs to attack opponents on the streets and on social media, subverting the judiciary and the education system, denouncing same-sex marriage as a cause of complete havoc that are making India safe for oligarchy and unsafe for nearly everyone else. There is nothing unique about this amalgam of domestic repression, ideological messianism, and state-pampered oligarchy, or its legitimation by Western political and financial institutions. In Russia, despotic rulers helped loyalists amass vast private fortunes by showering them with privatization deals, banking privileges, government contracts, and tax and trade concessions. Western corporations and banks channeled tainted Russian money into the pool of global capital, and law firms and PR companies made New York and London safe for Russian oligarchs. Bill Clinton complimented Boris Yeltsin on his superb work after he ordered tanks to fire on the Russian parliament and ensured his victory in the rigged presidential elections of 1996. George W. Bush, Tony Blair, Gerard Schroeder, and Silvio Berlusconi helped bleach the blood-stained record of Yeltsin's chosen successor. In 2001, Blair told the journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had been investigating Putin's war crimes in Chechnya, that it's my job as Prime Minister to like Mr. Putin. Politkovskaya was murdered in Moscow on Putin's birthday in 2006. In Putin's People, Catherine Belton describes many occasions when Russia's autocrat was confirmed in his assumption that the West's financial interests would outweigh concerns about his regime's abuse of the law and democracy. Those interests now account for another ethical and cognitive breakdown. Visiting New Delhi in January to explain to readers of the New York Times why Russia's war could make it India's world, Roger Cohen quoted Arundhati Roy. Hatred has penetrated into society at a level that is absolutely terrifying, then glossed. That may be, but for now, Modi's India seems brim with confidence. The Western rush to embrace Modi's India isn't only fueled by the profit motive. Increasingly, the mollycoddling of yet another exponent of crony capitalism and ethnic racial supremacism is driven by the imperatives of the new Cold War. The Biden administration's resolve, deepened by the war in Ukraine, somehow to contain China. Adani's lavish purchase of the port of Haifa came after the US put pressure on Israel to disallow his Chinese rival, the Shanghai International Port Group, from managing a port frequented by the Sixth Fleet of the US Navy. A persistent problem, however, for strategists and propagandists of the new Cold War is that Modi's way to power was paved by grisly and well-documented violence. The British Foreign Office was not alone in concluding in 2002 that Modi was directly responsible for the killing of more than 1,000 Muslims in Gujarat. In 2005, George W. Bush State Department invoked the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act to deny Modi's diplomatic visa application and also revoked his existing business visa under a section of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Ignoring his claim of exoneration from India's Supreme Court, the US rejected Modi's application again in 2012. Yet by September 2014, he had been shown around the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. by Barack Obama. In June 2016, he addressed a joint session of Congress on the subject of his and America's shared philosophy of freedom. Rupert Murdoch anointed Modi as India's best leader with the best policies since independence. Addressing packed stadiums in India and the US with his loyal friend, Trump confirmed Modi's place in a global far-right constellation. But it was liberal and centrist politicians, businessmen, economists and journalists in the West who built regimes of casual untruth about Modi and his India. There is something thrilling about the rise of Narendra Modi, Gideon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times, wrote in April 2014. As Modi arrived in Silicon Valley in 2015 and his government shut down the internet in Kashmir, Sheryl Sandberg declared she was changing her Facebook profile to honour the Indian leader. In January this year, Twitter and YouTube agreed to enforce the Indian government's ban on the BBC documentary. In 2019, Bill Gates ignored a letter from 3 Nobel Peace Prize winners, including Iran Shirin Ebadi, protesting against his decision to give a humanitarian award to the man whose nickname is the Butcher of Gujarat. Obama recalled talking to Modi about the teachings of Gandhi and Martin Luther King for readers of Times 2015 list of the 100 most influential people. He described him as if he were a character in Horatio Alger's story. Born in modest circumstances but now the leader of the world's largest democracy, Modi reflected the dynamism and potential of India's rise. Obama, the first Western leader to embrace Modi, became the only American president to visit India twice in 2 years, once as a chief guest at the Republic Day parade. Less than a year after leaving the White House, he was back in India on a speaking tour, praising Modi's Adani-led efforts against climate change at a leadership summit organised by a pro-Modi newspaper. The same VIP shindig recently paid Boris Johnson £260,000 for a speech, no doubt its bargain basement rate. Like the Russian elite, Modi and Adani have succeeded in bending repeatedly the moral arc of politics and journalism towards greed. Joe Johnson, who had to disentangle himself with haste from Adani's global cash nexus last month, was, as a reporter for the Financial Times, a rare practitioner of sober Western journalism on India during the 2000s, when opinion-making periodicals such as Time, Foreign Affairs, Newsweek and The Economist were hailing the country as a roaring capitalist success story. Unless India makes a dramatic investment in its human capital, Johnson wrote in 2006, its democratic advantages will turn into a demographic disaster in the form of a massive unemployable labour force. His prognosis has become even more menacing today as the country's population overtakes China's. The scope for labour-intensive jobs in Indian industry shrinks further. The large middle class, long fantasized about by foreign corporations, stubbornly fails to materialize, and private investment keeps falling despite lavish government spending on infrastructure. Modi's government has not made the budgetary allocations for public health and education that, as Johnson observed, will be necessary for securing a large demographic advantage. Instead, it has sought to deploy many of the unemployable and frustrated labour force as stormtroopers of Hindu supremacism, indoctrinating them with a garishly fabricated Indian past and equally kitsch daydreams of India's future as a world guru. In his latest avatars, however, as a Tory MP, Science Minister in David Cameron's cabinet, Baron Johnson of Marylebone, fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and dabbler in Adani's honeypot, Johnson has now turned to describing in The Spectator how the new India is helping shape this young century. Such U-turns occur frequently in the crisscrossing global networks of journalistic, academic, business and geopolitical opportunity forged by Modi and his oligarchs. The crudity of maneuver can still be breathtaking. While visiting Adani at his headquarters in Gujarat last year, Johnson's brother Boris took time off to plug JCB the day after the company's bulldozers were photographed demolishing Muslim-owned properties in Delhi. JCB's owners paid for some of Johnson's wedding last year and currently host the disgraced former Prime Minister at their $25 million mansion in London. Yet private avarice, which Putin cannily identified as central to public life in the West today, does not entirely explain the whitewashing of Modi or the greenwashing of Adani. Ideological delusion also plays a role in the mainstream Western narrative shaped during the Cold War. India, with its regular elections, long starred as a counterexample to many authoritarian and anti-Western countries. The tattered old fable about India's democracy being urgently revamped as the Biden administration pursues its new Cold War against Chinese and Russian autocracy. Walter Russell Mead, a leading foreign policy commentator, argues in the Wall Street Journal that the US should pursue greater intimacy with Modi's party since it will be calling the shots in a country without whose help American efforts to balance rising Chinese power are likely to fall short. As in the first Cold War, such strategic calculations, while keeping arms manufacturers and beltway think tanks busy, are impervious to observable facts. In the last year, while the West repeatedly sanctioned Russia, Modi turned the despoiler of Ukraine into India's biggest supplier of oil as well as military hardware. His government has urged state-owned corporations to explore the possibility of picking up stakes in Russian energy companies that were abandoned by Western companies. In recent months, India has also suffered humiliating military defeats and losses of territory to China, while becoming economically ever more dependent on imports from the country. No matter, India is now firmly fixed in the Cold War imagination as a military as well as a democratic counterweight to the free world's autocratic adversaries, and Western policymakers and commentators trumpet the country's virtues even more loudly than before. Speaking at a meeting last year of the anti-China military coalition Quad in Tokyo, Biden complimented Modi for making sure democracies deliver, because that's what this is about, democracies versus autocracies. In stalwart attendance at Biden's summit of democracy with Netanyahu last month, Modi invoked our sacred Mahabharata and our sacred Vedas, while insisting once again that India indeed is the mother of democracy. As New Delhi prepares to host a G20 summit in September, Western officials and opinion makers more keenly echo Modi's claims for India's democracy with words such as largest and vibrant. Both adjectives were deployed last month by a State Department spokesperson as he tried to evade comment on Modi's crackdown on the BBC. Visiting India in early March, Italy's far-right Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni described Modi as the most loved of all world leaders. A few days later, Australia's new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese joined him in a lap of honour in an improvised chariot at the new Narendra Modi cricket stadium in Gujarat. Such flattery helps Modi to protect himself domestically as a universally revered icon and further demoralise his political opposition. It encourages his fan base to think that Hindu superpowerdom is imminent, a demagogic vanity that is certain to be disappointed and to degenerate into vengeful xenophobia of the kind that fuels Putinism. Fawning on a Hindu supremacist, as his supporters routinely clamour for a genocide of Muslims in India, also entrenches lies and propaganda deeper in the public life of Western societies. Adani's business empire may or may not turn out to be the largest con in corporate history, but far greater dangers to civic morality, let alone democracy and global peace, are posed by those peddling the gigantic hoax of Modi's India, the first big fraud of the new Cold War. End of quote. So really, just a formidable article, really exposing the West's hypocrisy in trying to position solely states such as Russia and China as quote-unquote autocratic and undemocratic and all the rest of it, while they have such deep strategic and fawning relations at the feet of Narendra Modi in India. Really, really important details there. And it really speaks to the interests of the global anti-imperialist, pro-socialist workers and peasants and oppressed masses, that this article really clarifies that global alliance of finance capitalists, of colonial capitalists, all absolutely working together in this very manipulative and deceitful manner to ensure that people are divided while they loot the planet and our labour furthermore. There is one thing, perhaps if one could just kind of raise from the article, is this concept of quote-unquote Hindu supremacism. There is no Hindu supremacism. There is only a colonial supremacism, i.e. white supremacism, that can be internalized and is internalized by many oppressive ruling class elements, including the white colonial settler state of Israel, including the Western states, including Russia, and yes, even including Beijing, as well as India. It's white supremacy that has to be deconstructed at the heart of an analysis and a praxis that seeks to liberate humanity and the environment from the devastation of capitalism. Many thanks.